Welcome to Foresight TV, where we provide leadership food for the soul, helping senior living organizations have higher occupancy, lower turnover, and better cultures. Today's episode is made possible through the generous support of Connected Living, a technology company that helps senior living communities effectively communicate with residents, families, and team members. Here's today's show. Welcome to Foresight TV. And I'm going to adjust my camera here a little bit. Let's actually start by just having you talk a little bit about what you do, and then we'll dig into how you're changing the world of senior living.
Well, thanks. First, thanks for having me. Been a big fan for a long time, and I've really kind of enjoyed watch you go on the journey about learning about residential assisted living. And obviously we got a chance to have a great conversation about, our model and why we think it's going to be so important and in some ways so disruptive. So I live in Dallas. I've been in the senior housing industry for about 6 years now. My background totally not related to the industry. I'm probably the least qualified person you'll ever have on your show. But I got a great team in the Dallas area, and we're doing a couple projects down in Louisiana and then one in North Texas that is kind of our signature project, which we'll obviously go into on the show today. And, really excited to be here and look forward to kind of explaining to you why we think our model is sort of the perfect hybrid of two existing concepts.
So I gotta ask this question before we dig into it. How did you stumble across, get turned on by senior?
Yeah, no, great question. For me, it was personal. Like I'm sure a lot of operators. My dad went through a really difficult experience on hospice, and this was in 2014. And I spent the better part of a year trying to figure out if I wanted to sue the hospice company. And sort of at the end of that 1 year statute of limitations, I sort of stumbled into learning about residential assisted living. And I think my heart was open to the idea of being of service to people, and having been in business a long time and, more of a commodity business. I worked at a car dealership. I worked in the apartment industry, and I loved what I did, but I didn't really feel like I was positively impacting people's lives. And I've always wanted to sort of find a way to marry capitalism with good causes. So I'm a firm believer in conscious capitalism, impact investing. And so this kind of presented an opportunity where, not only could we make a living, but more important than that, we could make a living helping people. And, every person, I take out of a bad setting, out of a big box facility that they're not appropriate for, or take them out of a sort of a mom and pop facility that, maybe when the air conditioner breaks, that it takes a few extra days to get it fixed because, they're not very well capitalized. We really kind of see ourselves as kind of that, perfect in between as far as these big corporations, and then also these sort of small operations that can't have the scale to do everything you'd like them to be able to do.
Right. So I want to actually just take a tiny little aside here. I love your sort of founder or inspiration story. I do want to say that not everybody has that story, including me. I've always been somebody who's been sort of cause driven, but frankly, when I came into senior living, the first time many decades ago, it was really just money. And frankly, I didn't get it. And so I think you start better off if you go into it with a heart like you have. But, sometimes we all have different paths we travel in getting there. So I just want to say that if you're looking at that and saying, oh, man, my path to get into senior living was a lot more pedestrian than Lowe's or so many of the others I hear, that's okay. It doesn't matter. I'm right there with you. So
I don't want to be revisionist. I definitely don't want to be a revisionist. I got into the business because I thought it was a good business, but my heart was open to it because of my dad. So I don't want to definitely overplay that card. It was an important part of how I got into the business, but I definitely got into it, for capitalist reasons. But my heart was open to the concepts of service and those types of things because, there's a lot of other ways to make money. And this is a difficult business, and it's a especially challenging business in a pandemic. So I'm really fortunate to have all that happen. And I kind of consider myself, to your point, as having kind of stumbled into my passion. And I'm very lucky in that regard. And I think a lot of people that are in this industry certainly understand that.
Yeah. And Erica, thank you for that comment. And welcome to the senior living business. I think it is the finest place in the world to be. Of course, I wouldn't be here otherwise. I will tell you that when I look around the industry, one of the things I love about it is there are hardly any jerks in the industry. I used to work in the tech business, and you could write a book of names of people who were just complete apps. And there are a few in the industry. If you ask me to name them, I mean, I wouldn't really do it for you, but I've gone through this in my head, and I probably have 5 people on my list, and I know a lot of people. So we're glad you're here. Okay, let's actually get to the point of the show, right? Let's talk about this new, weird, cool model of senior living, assisted living that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the place I always like to start is everybody has a preconceived notion about what assisted living and what memory care are, I think. And generally, when I talk to people that aren't in the business, they kind of picture a nursing home. And then people that are in the business, they kind of picture the sort of large box facilities. And so essentially, there's really kind of two very polar concepts. The first is the thing everybody thinks about. These are the 100-bed, 200-bed, 300-bed facilities that are basically congregate housing to take care of assisted living and memory care needs. That's what all the sort of the big players invest in. That's the facility model. That's their physical plant. Usually it's 3, 4, 5 stories. Sometimes if it's an urban project, it can be even taller. And so it's just a very unique setting from where a lot of seniors don't really feel familiar with that environment. On the other end of the spectrum is kind of actually the original way we used to take care of people, which is just small houses, 8, 10, 12, sometimes 16 people. And the level of care that you can get in a place like that is generally quite a bit better. The meals are home cooked as opposed to, the same style of food that you would get at a cafeteria, or in some cases, there are assisted living providers that order their food from the same people that provide food for prisons. And so it's just a very different model. The challenge with that small residential assisted living model, in my opinion, is that it does do a much better job of providing care to residents, but it lacks a lot of scaling, right? Like very few residential care homes are going to have transportation. Very few residential care homes are going to have an activities director, right? So they're people are wearing multiple hats. And so, maybe you got a person that's a marketer and a nurse. And so, depending on what's going on that day, maybe they're not focused on the right thing. But the other thing is, and the theme of your show, and by the way, I got to give you a lot of credit. Investment grade REL is a beautiful concept. I hope you don't mind. We're going to incorporate that into how we explain it. Great concept that you came up with. But when you try to get financing for a residential assisted living facility as an operator or an owner, how do they appraise it? Do they appraise it as a single family home if it's a conversion, or do they try to imagine what you're going to do with the business? So it raises all these questions that you don't really have when you're dealing with the big box sort of commercial asset, because those are basically much easier to appraise because it's very clear what category they fall in. So my background is in REL. I have 6 residential assisted living facilities in the Dallas area. They're all in the center of Dallas. And, when I had one community, I was busy. When I had 2 communities, I was twice as busy. And when I got to 3, 4, and 5, I got less busy, if that makes any sense, because now I started having a team to help me. I wasn't the manager anymore. And so we got to thinking, look, there's all these advantages of a big building, and there's all these advantages of an REL. And, we believe in the care model of an REL, but we wanted to solve the problems of scaling, solve the problems of financing, make sure that we had the team in place, the activities coordinator, the marketer, the executive director, all the things that you really need to run a facility correctly. And our hybrid model was born. We call it planned care home communities. People call them cluster developments, things like that, but we prefer planned care home communities. And this is simply a campus of residential care homes, all on a commercial piece of land designed to look exactly like a neighborhood. The exception being that instead of it being a 3,000 or 4,000 square foot houses in the neighborhood that a family of 3 or 4 live in, it's a 9,000 square foot house with 16 seniors, either assisted living or memory care, living under one roof. So you get all the benefits of a small environment, but you have all the scale benefits of having multiple care homes on one campus, so that you can have combined management, you can have transportation, you can have a nice landscaped park area for residents to spend time outside. It really is limitless what you can do. And then of course it solves the financing challenges and really does step that REL up into an investment grade asset, where now all of a sudden, your capital stack is much more traditional. For people that don't know what a capital stack is, it's basically just kind of your ratio of debt and equity in a project. And when you do an REL, a lot of times it's very equity heavy. But the problem for owners is equity is very expensive. Debt's very cheap right now. So you really want to have the best possible ratio of debt to equity. And you can't really achieve that in an REL in most cases. And so this solves that problem very well, and really is the best of both worlds. We're basically taking the best things of a big building, the best things of the residential assisted living model, and we've combined them. And it's a beautiful concept that we're just really, really excited to bring to Texas and Louisiana.
Terrific. So I want to actually dig a little deeper into a couple of things here. So the other thing that, you talk about sort of the appraisal and figuring out the value with single family style homes that are converted, or in some cases purpose built. I've got a friend here in Sacramento where I live who has built a 6-bedroom community that I guess would work okay as a family home, but it was really built to be a high-end residential assisted living community. But it's, as you say, it's really hard to figure out what the value is. Could somebody else come in and buy it, run it, and replicate it? But I think the other thing that I've heard as I've talked to capital providers is, even if they look at that and say, man, the returns are great, I think I could, I feel comfortable with the investment. If you've got hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of capital you're trying to deploying it at even $1 million at a time is really a very tough thing to do, right? And so now you're talking about a package that's, I don't know what, 20, 30 million, 15 million for a campus, and that becomes more attractive to a capital provider.
No, 100%. I mean, I think, one of the things, I have a good friend who wrote a great book about this, that, one of the things you have to kind of ask yourself when you're engaging with investors is basically, is the project the right size, right? So, Warren Buffett may not care to invest in something for $1 million or even $10 million. It's too small for him, right? He spends more money on the lawyers and the paperwork than he would on the return from the investment. So definitely the larger opportunities definitely does open up the investment portfolio for those, smaller, mid-sized private equity groups or hedge funds, things like that. I've had several conversations with them myself. As of right now, our preferred strategies, we really like to engage with what I consider to be Main Street investors. So a lot of our investors are simply doctors, lawyers, professionals that have done well, and that, they create an excess of income, and they want to invest, $100,000, $200,000 into projects like this. And so a typical project for us might have, 30, 35 investors. And so we like that model because, frankly, it does two things. Number one is you get to engage the community to invest with you, which is always great. And look, I'm of the philosophy that, the Wall Street game is pretty rigged. This is my opinion. And I think that a lot of people would be better served by investing in people they know, people they can have access with, actual real tangible things, rather than going to the Wall Street casino and betting on black and hoping it comes up black. And so that's really a big part of what we want to do. A big part of our ethos is we really want to help other people, reach financial freedom or generate cash flow or generate financial success by simply investing passively in these types of projects.
Great. So then what do you do about the debt portion of it? Are you having trouble finding debt financing for it?
No, I mean, honestly, so I think there's two questions. In general, construction loans for assisted living, memory care, and a lot of healthcare projects are some of the hardest pieces of debt to get. So it is difficult. I don't want to, if someone's having a problem right now, I certainly don't want to diminish that it's a difficult process. We had a lot of great success. Our sort of strategy is we go to community banks that have a really strong presence in the community, that number one, most time in their charter, they have a mission that's just beyond, we're going to give them a great return on their investment and a safe investment if they're a lender, but they have a mission like they want to improve their community, right? And so if they know that we have a dearth of good, clean, safe, affordable assisted living or memory care, then they're more likely to do that. So our general strategy is we go to community banks. We find they're very flexible. They're sometimes a smidge more expensive than some of the other options, but they're flexible. They get it. You can have a strong personal relationship. So we usually construct with that debt, and then generally what we'll do is our plan is to do a refinance that'll probably be more of the government sponsored entity, possibly the HUD, more of the Fannie Mae product as sort of our takeout. So that's one of the ways we'll kind of boost investor returns is after we stabilize the asset. get the communities full, producing cash flow, then we'll invite the Fannie Mae's and the HUDs of the world to look at the project for takeout financing.
Great. So I've got a couple of questions here in the chat. I'm actually going to hold those for a second because I want to touch on a couple of other things first, but
Sure.
they're really important questions and we will get to them. The first question I have is this: from the perspective of, I'm going to sort of wrap this in a multi-part question. There are two things I'm really sort of interested in right now. The first is that, are you feeling more hesitant because of the pandemic than you were before? And sort of relative to that, what does marketing look like, competing with more traditional senior living?
Couple great questions, pretty different actually. So let's start with the pandemic. There's two things that are happening from my point of view. So the first is that, look, it's not an easy time to be in this business. It's always been a challenging business, especially from a staffing perspective. You start dealing with, caregivers. Are schools open? Are they closed? Are they looking for childcare? Do they get sick and have to miss work for a couple of weeks? So look, it's a really challenging time to be in the business. We're really fortunate. Our team is great. And I'll sort of answer your question like this. We don't have a single case of COVID in our Dallas operation. And it's very difficult for very many providers to say that. I think when it's all said and done, we look back at when this is all over, if it is ever over, but when it's over, we'll look back and I think something like 30 to 35% of all deaths in America will have occurred directly from long-term care providers. And, that's a terrible, terrible thing. So we're bullish on our model because here's the thing that I want you to think about. Picture a typical 200-bed assisted living facility, or let's just say 100-bed assisted living facility. And how many people come through the door every day? Employees, vendors, visitors, deliveries, whatever the case may be. And let's just say there's 100 people that come in a day. Now picture my 96-bed property that we're building in Texas. It's basically the same size, but because it's 6 16-bed houses that are separately licensed, sort of self-contained entities, then a building may only have 10 people come in each day. And so from a building perspective, your chances of getting asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, person, a carrier, a vector coming through the front door, you can reduce it by a factor of like 10, 20, 30, or 40. And if you have an outbreak, you can contain it in that individual building. So you don't necessarily expose your entire resident population. So anecdotally, and there's a lot of articles and data that really support this, that basically smaller congregate settings, our boutique style settings that we use, are much better at infection control. This was true of the flu. This was true of the norovirus. We've had those certainly bad flu seasons in Dallas and bad norovirus outbreaks, and we just haven't had those problems. So our model is far, far superior for infection control. So the way I look at it is that I think the industry is going to move toward smaller, and we already was doing so. Everyone's been trying to figure out sort of the smaller thing. I'm sure you've been around long enough to remember when they came up with neighborhoods, right? The ideas in those big buildings where they're somehow going to make them, small settings inside of a big setting. It's a decent idea, but it's not the same as being in a home-like setting like what we build. But ultimately, I think COVID is absolutely an accelerant. Trends that were already happening, it speeds them up. And so I think you're going to see a huge move towards smaller congregate settings because of their ability to battle COVID and have great infection control procedures. So I'm bullish in the sense that I'm glad we're coming online at the times that we're coming online, this year, and you sort of post-vaccine, things like that. But I am scared because at the end of the day, I think a lot of people are afraid. A lot of people are scared to move into congregate settings. And also too, and this is not to be morbid, but I don't really know the answer to the question of how many of our potential customers, we might have a customer in Denton or Lake Charles that isn't ever going to be our customer because they passed away from the virus. And so it's a scary time, but I'm absolutely confident that our model is going to perform superior in this setting just because of the track record and just simple math. Less people through the front door is going to reduce your chances.
Yeah. So let's actually look at a couple of these sort of investment type of questions. The first one's from Jeff, and he asked about coupling this idea in redevelopment areas
Sure.
and getting incentives there. Have you looked at that? Do you see that as an option?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jeff. We're land intensive, and I want to make that abundantly clear. I don't have in my facility. There's not a single elevator. There's not a single stair. Our administration building has a second story, but we're all single story. And so if you're all single story, we're basically building horizontally, not vertically. And so I don't necessarily think that our model is really well designed for urban infill type of opportunities, because generally those go up, and obviously urban infill land is pretty expensive. Could be a great strategy for you. To be honest, our strategy at Goodhorn Capital and Sage Oak, the two companies that sort of are involved in this process for us, is we like secondary and tertiary markets. We love suburban areas, outside of bigger cities or sort of smaller markets. We can get land that's affordable and allows us to do our horizontal models. We don't have to sort of compromise our physical plant. But the second thing is that what we've noticed is there's nobody in a boardroom in New York saying, how do we solve the senior housing problem in random suburbs of Dallas? The other thing that COVID's kind of done is there's kind of a move away from cities. And so a lot of the data that we're seeing from the demographic point of view is that suburbs and these ring cities are really the place to be. And so I think we just got very fortunate that one of the unintended consequences of the pandemic has been sort of a move out of cities in some cases, and a move into more suburban areas where you can have space and not live in an apartment, things like that. So a lot of our projects really are benefiting from some of that sort of second order effects of COVID and how that's happened. So great question. Not an area of expertise for me for sure. And we really focus on those ring cities and suburban cities as a strategy.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about redevelopment, but I've talked to some people who've done that. So I actually think it could be a great strategy for you or somebody else. So John Gonzalez asked, and I'm kind of curious too, what kind of ROI are you promising investors? I mean, promising is probably not the right, or what are you projecting for investors and what kind of time frame?
Yeah, great question, John. So first things first, you nailed it, Steve. My securities attorney would probably pull the plug on this thing if I use the word promise. But I understand what you're saying. So obviously any investment, there's things that can go wrong, and you don't always, get the projection. Sometimes you undershoot it and you actually return more money to investors. We're typically in a model for what we like to use them. There's different metrics you can use. We prefer to use internal rate of return. Because it does include the time value of money. So the idea is that if you give money today, it's better than getting money later, right? So we use internal rate of return. Most of our projects are usually on a 7 to 10 year timeline. We've done some opportunity zone investing, which 10-year holds are very attractive in opportunity zone investing. And so a typical our internal rate of return for us is usually around 20%. But with opportunities to add more facilities, to sell off pieces of the land, we have several that are able to move into the mid 20s and sometimes even the 30% range. So it's a good rule of thumb for us, around a 10-year hold and around a 20% internal rate of return. To maybe put that in some parlance that everybody would understand, a lot of times if you give us $100,000 over the course of 10 years, we'll give you $300,000 to $400,000. So the equity multiple is usually between 3 and 4, kind of depending on the project, and that's kind of the total of all the things. And of course, there are also some pretty significant tax benefits as well. Depending on everyone's unique situation, we can often save them some taxes, and we also do generate quite a bit of tax credits in this business that we pass on to the investors as well.
So I'm Fred, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. So de-licensed Florida assisted living, convert to independent living, concierge, boutique-like, and outsource healthcare piece. Does that make any sense? I mean, I think that it might make sense. I think that, I haven't seen it in the last 4 or 5 years, but I would say 5, 6, 7 years ago, there were a lot of assisted living operators who were complaining pretty bitterly about independent living that became assisted living light, and where they bring in home care. But you're actually doing most of your care in your. Are you doing nurses in your?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so to his point, or to your point, I don't think assisted living people can really complain about independent living, because assisted living providers are doing the exact same thing to skilled nursing, right? Yeah, so, I think if you really step back and look at this, independent living is doing everything they can to hold on to residents longer. And that includes, they bring in services, their vendor services. They can't provide the services themselves, generally under their licensure. But then you have assisted living and memory care holding on to residents longer as well, that maybe feels like, their care needs are certainly potentially worthy of going to skilled nursing, but they don't have to go to skilled nursing. So I think everybody downstream is doing everything they can to retain residents longer when they can. So I do laugh when assisted living gets mad at IL, because SNF is certainly mad at us, and especially our model, because of our ratios, because of our nursing oversight. And I'll be happy to answer your nursing question. So in Texas, not true in Louisiana, but in Texas, you don't have to have a nurse. We committed to having nursing oversight a couple of years ago in our Dallas operation. We're one of the few care home operations that have an RN, and at times we even had a couple of nurses. Because we deal with high acuity residents, so maybe 20% of our residents are really cross shopping us versus skilled nursing, and they're basically just trying to figure out, hey, I know I don't fit in the big box because I can't do the 1-10 to 1-20 ratios, and I don't need 100-yard hallways, but I also don't want to go to a skilled nursing environment that oftentimes is really just a hospital with a better paint job. And so we really think the nursing oversight is important. I think our communities in Lake Charles and Denton will almost assuredly have a medical director presence. So we'll probably have a doctor that oversees the care of our residents. In our Dallas operation, it just makes more sense to have more of a house call relationship with doctors. So we have several house call physicians. So we bring in almost every service you can imagine. So podiatry, we even can do mobile dentistry. If someone breaks their arm, mobile X-ray, mobile swallow. We can take labs and send them off without a resident having to leave.
I want to get to a couple more questions here. One, sure. Are you raising money under Reg D 506C? I assume you know what that means. I don't, but
Sure. Yeah. Great question. If I wasn't, I'd be in trouble, because this would probably be general solicitation. The answer to that question is yes. We are using the 506C exemption. For anyone else listening that's curious, there's a few different ways you can raise capital legally. There's crowdfunding, things like that. But what we do is called private placements. And there's a couple different exemptions you have to use, so you don't have to be a registered security. And the 506C, the two main components are you're allowed to generally solicit. So I could do commercials if we wanted to. Arguably, that's what this would be in theory. And then secondarily, all your investors have to be accredited. So the federal government's like, hey, right, if you're going to generally solicit, we just want to make sure that your investors have a reasonable understanding of the risk they're taking. And the federal government has somehow decided a certain dollar amount means that you're smarter or smart enough to take those risks, I suppose, for whatever reason they came up with that.
Great. So let's talk a little. I want to come back a little bit to operations and sort of sales and marketing. What's it cost for a resident compared to sort of a traditional, typical large assisted living, an Atria, Brookdale, that kind of community?
Yeah. So we're generally going to be, our strategy generally is we're at sort of either the top of the middle market or the bottom of the luxury market, depending on from a price perspective. So a lot of our stuff is going to be kind of the heart of our pricing is going to be in that $6,000 a month range. And so it's not going to be necessarily super expensive. Obviously, there's places that are $12,000 a month, $10,000 a month all over the country. So we're kind of in that range. We feel comfortable there, primarily because, when you start getting much lower, you really start getting to a point where you have to start making labor sacrifices. And that's just not our philosophy. We want to have a great ratio of caregivers. We want to pay our caregivers well. One of the biggest challenges this industry faces is you haven't had a lot of caregiver wage inflation. It's coming. It has to come. We have to pay caregivers better. We have to treat caregivers better in this industry. But, that puts a squeeze on the $3,500, $4,000 a month assisted living and memory care residents. And it's a real need. And so we definitely have a squeeze in that regard. And so I would rather at the end of the day work with clients that afford us the ability to pay our caregivers well and to treat our caregivers well. And, there are other places that I think in their effort to get really competitive on price, they're really making their staff and their team suffer, or they don't have enough caregivers, and we just want to offer top-notch service. And so that's kind of where we are. In comparison to other buildings, I would say we're generally, in the top 20% or top 30% in terms of pricing. We're absolutely able to be price competitive. In a lot of our communities, we don't have to do levels of care. So it's a flat monthly billing. So residents like that, because a lot of times when they move into the aforementioned facilities that you named, there's a lot of bait and switch that happens where it's like you move in at a base rent, and within like 3 months you have like 3 or 4 levels of care that's being added on, and by the time you do that, you're generally more expensive than Sage Oak, my company, would be with a flat pricing structure. So we just sort of assume that our residents are going to have needs, and we don't charge them for those needs. Generally, it's built in.
Gotcha. Again, the question, have you used affordable options such as shared for lower cost of residents or high revenue? So I'm thinking they're talking shared rooms. Probably sure. You would do that. So the other actually, I have one more question for you. Just about out of time here. But so the levels of care was the one thing, and it sounds like it sort of depends whether you do levels of care or not, particular circumstances. But the other question I have for you is, can you talk just for a minute about what your staffing ratios look like?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So in regards to levels of care, we're almost certainly never going to have levels of care in our memory care setting. I think people come to memory care generally pretty late in the game. And that's been something that obviously the industry would like to improve upon, getting residents to come to memory care sooner. So generally most memory care residents do need a lot. And so generally are able to do fixed pricing on that. On assisted living, you sometimes will find that if you don't do levels of care, that sometimes you won't get those sort of more independent residents that still have a little bit of needs. And so having that levels of care option may be pretty important in our assisted living operation. In regards to our ratios, that's really part of our secret sauce. Generally during the day, we're going to target between 1 to 4 and 1 to 6. So we'll have one direct care staff. That's not the gardener and the maintenance guy and me sitting in the office. That's direct care staff. 1 to 4, 1 to 6 is kind of where our ratios typically fall during the day. And then at night, we never really want to get much out of 1 to 8, 1 to 10. And so to give you some perspective in the industry, that's generally anywhere from double to triple what you see in the industry. So sometimes in the industry, we'll see 1 to 10, 1 to 12, 1 to 15 during the day. And you can see some crazy stuff at night, 1 to 20, 1 to 25. And we don't think it's sustainable. And we don't think that facilities are really fulfilling their obligation with those types of ratios.
Great. So we are out of time. I'm actually want to do one quick commercial for me. We are just launching a text community. It's not going to be advertising, but if you if you go to text to 916-659-5289, the word TV, we will put you on the list. You'll get a text message with just additional bonus material that you won't get anyplace else, whether it's on our blog site or social media, but we just like to have a closer relationship. And of course, you can text back to me. When you text to that, the first time you'll get an auto response that'll ask you for a little more information, so we know who you are, and we'd love to have you join our community. So, Loe, one last question for you. So I know from looking at the comments, I know there are going to be people who want to contact you. How
Sure.
do they find you?
Cool. I can give them a couple options. So obviously when your name's Loe Hornbuckle, I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. So you can just type in Loe Hornbuckle on LinkedIn and I'll be happy to accept you. But also too, in preparation for doing the show, I've written a book it kind of weaves in the story of my father and kind of weaves in our operational sort of ideas and how the company got its name, things like that. It's called The Sage Oak Story. I'll be happy to give anybody a free electronic version of that book. All they need to do is, our private equity firm is called Good Horn Capital, GOODHORN capital.com. And if they go there, put in their name and email address, we'll give them a free copy of the book. And that way they can have it, learn a little bit about us. I find that one of the best ways to do your due diligence as an investor is to get to know the operator and what they think about their philosophies. And that book really tries to give some exposure to that. It's the same book we would give out to a family when they came on a tour, for example. So just go to goodhorncapital.com, or they can find me on LinkedIn, Loe Hornbuckle, and happy to start a relationship, get to know people. One thing I want to make really clear: we're not raising money for anything. This is not me coming on the show to sell anything, but we will one day, and we like to plant seeds and get into relationships. So now is a great time to start chatting with us, getting to know us getting to know you, and then down the road, if there's an opportunity that makes sense, happy to have a conversation.
Perfect. And we will drop that web address into the comment section for the video after this is done. So, Lo, thank you very much. We are a little more than out of time, but I really, really appreciate the conversation and I look forward to actually getting a chance to get together in person and coming and visiting your community when things sort of break loose. I actually have an appointment next week for my first COVID shot, so I'm very excited about that. And I think the world is starting to come back to normal, which is terrific. So, again, thank you very much.
Well, hey, thank you for having me. You do a great job. And I believe we're over time because I believe you and I could do this for hours and hours on end.
Forever.
So we have to set a deadline somewhere, right? So thank you so much,
That's
Steve,
right.
for all you do.